Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Muslims around the world have been struggling to carry out their traditional religious practices in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. But in some countries, the virus has also stirred up anti-Islamic sentiment. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The virus came just as Muslims were preparing for Ramadan, forcing them to celebrate at home rather than in traditional groups. Meanwhile, in New York, traditional Muslim burial practices have been disrupted because of the virus. And then there has been an outbreak of anti-Islamic violence in India. Take a look at the impact of COVID-19 on Muslims. We have on the phone with us Muqtedar Khan. He's an associate professor and founder of the Islamic Studies Program at the University of Delaware. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me, Don.
So let's begin with the impact that this virus has had in terms of the traditional rituals, particularly Ramadan, on Muslims.
See, the thing is that during the month of Ramadan, Muslims just rush to the mosques. They try to pray all the 5 prayers in the mosque. We have a special prayer after the breaking of the fast, after the night prayer, where we recite the entire Quran. We usually divide the Quran into 30 parts and recite one part on every night and read the entire Quran during the month. And some people even go early or in the middle of the night to pray in the Quran. So the Quran becomes the centerpiece of Muslim spiritual life. And because of COVID, all the mosques were shut and nobody was able to go there. And so I kind of described this as that our Ramadan was like a donut without a center for the first time. And so the mosque, which played a critical role in the spirituality and the ritual life of Muslims, essentially was sidelined, and so Muslims had to find new ways of performing their rituals and indulge in their spiritual practices. And actually, I'm amazed. I actually gave a small talk on this, as I was impressed and amazed at how quickly the Muslim community, nearly all over the world, adapted to the new circumstances using essentially technology, computers and internet and Zoom and other such products to essentially have a very fruitful and spiritually rewarding Ramadan. At least in the U.S., many of the scholars and spiritual leaders that I spoke to have said that they have had an exceptionally great Ramadan. And that was an interesting conclusion. There's a lot of socializing and partying in Ramadan too, because people invite other Muslims to break fast with them, and so you're running from literally from mosque to somebody's house and then back to mosque. There's a lot of running around involved in some cultures. And all of that was like put to a halt, and Muslims stayed at home and used the extra time that they got to indulge in reading. It also inspired many people to up their charity. So a lot of Muslims gave far more charity this year than they would normally.
When you indicated that some of the scholars that you talked to said that actually had a fairly good Ramadan, what did they mean by that? What kind of characteristics did they feel they had?
Well, let me give you a few examples. So, for example, Fridays, we usually have 4 or sometimes 5 Fridays in the month of Ramadan. Very rarely 5. I don't remember ever having 5. So what happens with these Fridays is that we have a Friday sermon and people come and have congregational prayers. And because we could not organize these congregational prayers, we did virtual sermons. So for example, I did a virtual sermon for a community in Lancaster, which is about 60 miles from here. In fact, the coming Friday, I will be doing another sermon for them virtually, sitting in my study. I will give the sermon recorded, and it will be premiered on YouTube, and people after prayer will, people before they pray listen to the sermon on YouTube and then pray. So, but what it also did was some people who thought that maybe this does not amount to a proper sermon decided not to call it a sermon and called it Friday Reflections. The moment they took the category of sermon away from it, they suddenly realized that if this is a Friday reflection, then we can open it. And so suddenly a large number of women were giving Friday reflections through Zoom and on Facebook Live. And so for the first time, I think that Muslim women took a much, much bigger role than normal in the spiritual and religious life of the Muslim community. There were many, Zoom-based study circles that emerged, and also more women engaged in this and participated in it. So from the gender perspective, you could say that this was something that took the community forward. And the good thing is that now that they have adapted to the innovative practices, I think the community is not going to step back to where it was a year ago. And so in that sense, there has been something incredibly beautiful. Even the Eid, the celebration, the festival after Ramadan, was mostly virtual. And so we gave virtual sermons and we had virtual celebrations on it. I did something very unusual this Ramadan. I launched a series of conversations. I call them conversations with my last name. And I spoke to people who are contemporary translators or commentators of the Quran. One is from the Middle East and from overseas. And we studied the Quran, and I conducted discussions with them. And a lot of people have watched this issue. So in that sense, I think that intellectually, spiritually, from a knowledge-based perspective, this was an exceptional Ramadan. But from a social perspective, it was obviously deficient. I remember hugging nearly everybody that I would meet on the day of Eid. I only hugged my family, immediate family. So yes, from a social perspective, reconnecting with people who perhaps you don't see for months and then see them in month of Ramadan, that was missing. But virtually we connected with more. Some of these seminars, we had people from other parts of the Muslim world joining in. So in that sense, we had a more global Ramadan, but a less physical, engaging, reconnecting with the community. There's something else that I would also like to share, that because the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, lived during the period of, during his lifetime, there was a plague. And so we have teachings from our Prophet on how to deal with plague. So for example, there is a very famous tradition from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he says that when you hear that there is a plague in a land, do not go to it. And if you are in a land where there is a plague, do not leave that land. So essentially, shelter in place is how I understood that tradition. Don't go where there is a plague, and if you are in a place where there is a plague, do not leave there. Basically, do not spread it, do not cause contagion. So that tradition became very important, and nearly every scholar was talking about it in their sermons. But there's also something interesting, and this started first in Bahrain, that during a certain environmental issue, I think there was some kind of a storm brewing that during the Prophet's life, that the call for prayers was slightly changed. So the call for prayer says, please come to successful life, please come to the mosque to pray. They changed the last line and said, pray at home. This was during the time of Prophet's life. So that call for prayer also became very popular globally. And suddenly Muslims said, what? The Prophet said pray at home because there is some trouble outside? And so people went and rediscovered some of the sources which had remained dormant. And so it became much more easier for Muslims to preach shelter in place and stuff like that.
Just briefly explain to listeners the significance of Ramadan.
Ramadan is, there are 5 pillars of Islam which are well known. One of the pillars of Islam is to fast from dawn to dusk in the month of Ramadan. So Muslims fast for a whole month. Like for example, in Delaware, we were fasting from around 4:30 in the morning till about 8:45 in the evening. We don't drink, we don't eat anything, no food, no sexual activity, no fighting, no getting angry, no getting upset. So there is both a physical fast, and there is also a spiritual fast. We also try to recite the Quran as much as we can, pray as much as we can, meditate on God as much as we can. So the idea is like a spiritual boot camp, intensive boot camp for 1 month, where we are encouraged to give more and more in charity. And the hope is that the habits that you develop in the month of Ramadan to avoid committing crimes and sins and doing good things. So avoiding doing bad things and doing more good things in the month of Ramadan. That momentum hopefully will keep us doing good things for the next 11 months before the next boot camps come.
I want to turn to something that I read about, which was in New York, and which we saw, of course, a large number of deaths. And one of the things I read was that the burial ritual that is done for Muslims got interrupted. Tell me a little bit about that and what you know about how the community dealt with that situation.
So the way Muslims deal with their funerals is we try to bury a person as quickly as possible. So sometimes on the same day. So there are examples. To give you an example, my father died at 1 a.m. at night, and by the afternoon prayer, so in less than 11 hours, he was buried. And and one of the things that we do is there is a ritual washing of the body, and usually it is done by family and friends. It's a very systematic cleaning of the body, and then you wrap it up in a shroud, and then you bury the body. But apparently this time in places like New York and New Jersey, where there were many Muslim deaths. In fact, New York Times had an article saying there were Islamic centers which were having more than 15 funerals per week, so nearly 2 a day. So what they were done is that apparently the bodies that were given to them were in sealed bags, so they could not even wash the bodies. So the imams then issued fatwas or edicts saying that just pray and pour some water over that part and then bury it. So to families, etc., it was truly traumatic, burying bodies without the ritual bath. I remember washing my father's body, and I was constantly crying, but I also kept thinking of my brother who was in the States at that time, who couldn't come for it, and I kept thanking God that I was there to perform the final rites of my father. So these are very emotional moments, and people have not been able to attend funerals. Some places only 2 people are allowed, 1 imam and 1 member of the family, so the rest of the people are not even able to participate in the ritual rites of the funeral. So yes, it has been very traumatic. And usually, the COVID doesn't strike once, it strikes multiple times in families. Usually other members of the family also get it. So there are families, Muslim families, especially in New Jersey and New York, which have had more than 1 death in their family. And so they had to suffer through this. It has been very painful. And I don't know whether your audience realizes that, but the Muslim community, especially the immigrant side of the community, has a disproportionately large number of doctors and health professionals. The medical professional is highly valued, especially in South Asian societies. And, I say jokingly that everybody from South Asia is born pre-med, So they're born pre-med, then they choose to be a doctor or not. So we have tons and tons of doctors and nurses and others in the community, and they've all been on the front lines, and there have been several infections and several deaths. Young Muslim doctors have died. I read a story about a Muslim family in New York where the father and all 3 daughters are nurses, and all 4 of them were fighting COVID in the same hospital. So my heart went out to their mother and wife. She has 4 members, all 4 members of her family on the front line. So in that sense also it has been very challenging, the experience, and it still is.
I also understand, particularly in New York, that being taxi cab drivers, restaurant staff, constructions, at that end of the economic scale, there are also a lot of Muslims who participate. And obviously, if you're out in the public and you have to interact, that also, I would expect, have an impact on the number of people who might contract the disease.
Yes, and also these professions have not been able to, actually earn their living normally. So there is a segment of the Muslim community, especially in bigger areas, which have been hurt. There is my favorite Indian restaurant on Main Street here in Newark, and I thought I would order some food from there, and I found out that his restaurant has been closed for a month, and my heart really went out, and so he thought I really needed food, and so he said, if you give me a few hours, we will prepare at home and bring you food. I said, no, that's not what I was working to. I was just trying to patronize the restaurant to help it around, and I found that all the employees, etc., were now jobless because the restaurant got shut down. And I think this is common to everybody. All small businesses in the country have been hurt tremendously as a result of this. Some have lost businesses forever, which may never recover, and others have hopefully managed to cope. So while we don't have a proper way of assessing the economic damage the community has suffered, I think that while we may have suffered economically, there has been a tremendous spiritual growth in the community all over the world as a result of this. In some places, yes, like India, Muslims have been kind of demonized because of a couple of, shall we say, unwise decisions made by some Muslim groups. But otherwise, more or less, Muslims have really risen to the challenge of the COVID Ramadan.
I wanted, by the way, to turn to India because as I was reading that there is a rising antipathy, I guess, towards Muslims in the press. There's also some Muslim businesses have been boycotted. At one point, I think I read where some Muslim volunteers were helping out, trying to ration out help to others, were described as coronavirus terrorists. What's going on with that, particularly in India?
For the last few years, actually, there has been significant oppression of religious minorities in India because of the rise of the Hindu nationalist movements. And this is not something new. This is so old that when Obama was president, he spoke about it very specifically, that I wish that Gandhian values would influence the way Indian government was dealing with its Muslim minorities. So you can find those quotations by President Obama when he was president and even afterwards. So what happened was there is a Muslim community group called Tablighi Jamaat, which had a conference around the 20th of March, and they had some foreigners come in from Indonesia and Malaysia who were COVID positive at that time. And so there's rumor spread that Muslims are deliberately spreading it, even though, some of the policies of the government led to literally millions of displaced workers. People from large cities traveled thousands of miles in large processions. There were Hindu and other religious events which were also not, what should we say, maintaining social distancing or wearing masks, etc. All of these in late March. So, but as a result of that, things began to get worse. The vernacular media and some of the Hindu nationalists started blaming Muslims as spreaders of COVID, etc. Now they have, of course, switched to attacking China. But it is so bad that as of today, yesterday there was an article published in, I think, Pennsylvania Daily, where a university professor of Penn, UPenn professor, Professor Saswati Sarkar, she actually has been tweeting saying that Islam's contribution, COVID-19 is Islam's contribution to India. And she has also said that every person who has died or who has acquired this is somehow Muslims are responsible. So these demonization of Islam and Muslims also open up, especially in India, and that has led to Muslim vendors, etc., unable to to sell their goods in Hindu neighborhoods, and 80% or more of India is Hindu. So Muslims in India have suffered a little bit, but that group which had made that mistake of hosting that conference, and religious groups all across the world have shown less respect and less regard for social distancing, etc. Even churches in the United States have been going crazy. Look at Donald Trump's the event that he hosted in Tulsa. There was no social distancing in the stadium. But they were just focusing on Muslims of India as saying they're spreading it, and that has led to violence and discrimination that has increased. And now that hatred is coming to the U.S. also, with professors in respectable universities trying to blame Islam. I mean, Islam is a religion. I don't know how Islam spreads COVID, even though there are Islamic teachings specifically which advocate social distancing, etc. So there is an ugly side to it. It was targeting Muslims first in India. Now it's targeting China, and because of the geopolitical tensions between India and China now, so people are using this. Our own president has used the word Kung Flu to refer to COVID-19, which a lot of people think is a racist slur. And Asian Americans are feeling very frightened here in the U.S. as a result of some of the racist ways in which the virus is being talked about. So yes, there is a dark side to it. People all over the world, in all communities, in all religions, have really come forward to not only face the challenge of COVID-19, but to help each other. I mean, if you look at the medical profession, I talked to a psychiatrist about this, and she tried to point out to me that one of the things that we are not talking about is the mental health of the medical professionals, as well as the burnout of medical professionals who are working, like hours and hours and dealing with the COVID patients and the challenges that the pandemic has posed to the medical system. So yes, by and large, the human race has risen up and showed the best side of it, but unfortunately there are some of us who want to show the other side too.
I want to finally turn to something that you touched on a moment ago, which is the religious traditions and how they deal with the plague. You indicated with Muhammad, he certainly had what appears to be some recommendations. Tell me a little bit about those traditions. There's the Jewish tradition, Christians, and obviously Hindu traditions.
Well, I did a series of discussions with religious leaders from various communities about what their faith teaches. So it was interesting to me. The person who spoke from the Hindu tradition was not a trained pastor or pundit, but he talked about how certain aspects of Hindu lifestyle, such as cleanliness and vegetarianism, is something that would, in the long term, if adapted widely, would continue to protect people from pandemics of this sort. So that was an interesting point from his perspective. So the Abrahamic tradition, the Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all have explicit texts that deal with pandemics. So because of the story of Moses and the Pharaoh, where God visited Egyptians with all kinds of plagues, I think it's 5 plagues or 8 plagues in the Bible. So there are texts which talk about pandemics. Now, there can be a positive way of looking at it, and there's a negative way of it, where you will then attribute these pandemics as something as God's vengeance or God's punishment against people. So some religious people came out and made hateful comments such as, oh, this is a punishment for homosexuality, or this is a punishment for certain deviancies in the societies that they see, which are neither confirmed nor denied by God. But nevertheless, it does create an ugly moment in society. However, the fact that there are religious teachings does enable this. So, for example, I gave you already examples of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings about how to deal with plague, which came in very handy for Muslims to adapt. But also with Christianity, during the Roman Empire, when there were the plagues attacking southern Europe, the only people who went around helping those who were infected by plague were Christian monks. And then suddenly the population was awakened to this new religion and this faith where love and service was so important. And as a result of the service that Christian monks provided to many Europeans infected by plague, Christianity began to spread very fast in Europe. So in many ways, the Abrahamic tradition have some kind of connection to plagues and have teachings which then becomes important to talk about it. I talked to a Rabbi Michael Beans here in Delaware, and he told me as to how during Passover they normally do talk about plagues that were visited upon Egyptians. And so this time, there was more poignancy and more seriousness with which those stories were narrated and listened to.
So as you look ahead, do you think that this plague or this pandemic is going to permanently change some of the rituals, some of the ways that Muslims connect with one another, as you indicated earlier?
It has opened doors to new practices, definitely, new practices, definitely. We have suddenly realized that so many things can be done virtually. And I am curious to see how it evolves going forward. And it also is going to give opportunities, I think, for women particularly to play a greater role in the spiritual life of Muslims. It has also expanded the spiritual, it has expanded the discourse. For example, there are only 7 or 8 mosques in Delaware, or 9 mosques, depending on how you count them. So on any given Friday, only 9 people can give sermons, or if you have 2 congregations, only 18 people can give sermons. But now that people are talking about spiritual things, and they have got used to using technology and internet and Facebook Live and YouTube, etc., you will find that a lot and lots of people who would otherwise not be engaged in preaching will be sharing their religious ideas and religious thoughts on social media. Already social media had become a big, shall we say, purveyor or spreader or distributor of religious ideas. There are superstars on YouTube with millions of followers from all over the world preaching already. But this has, I think, given greater impetus and greater legitimacy to performing rituals using social media. In the past, there were only lectures and talks, and perhaps we might see more rituals being performed through this. It also had a very connecting moment. Like, for example, lots of my friends and relatives who live abroad who I had never met, they celebrated their Eid this year by listening to me give a virtual Eid sermon, and they would otherwise never, ever get to see me give a sermon. I mean, they can see the videos of it, but not be participant of it, but this time they were. So that is also another beautiful aspect of it. Where does it go further? That it will only depend. But the good thing that came out of it is that this is really very important, is that Muslims all over showed a progressive proclivity, which to me is fantastic. They did not, sit back and say, oh, this is not how the Prophet is, oh, this is innovative, this is not permissible in our faith, and so on and so forth. We didn't see much of that. We saw that in the beginning, especially before even Ramadan started, with Friday sermons. People were reluctant to shut it down and reluctant. Some of it is financially motivated because, people, when they come to the mosques, they give donations, and if they're not coming, the donation will definitely drop. So there is a financial side to it, which will become apparent after some time. But otherwise, the spirituality has definitely expanded. And I see now some of the scholars who were giving lectures, etc., are now continuing to give the lectures and spiritual talks using Zoom and Facebook Live and YouTube, which they were not doing 3 months ago. And people have now also got in the habit of watching. So that is a good thing, I think.
Well, we've been speaking with Muqtedar Khan. He's an associate professor and founder of the Islamic Studies Program at the University of Delaware. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you very much, Don, for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.